Chapter 1. The curtain rises. Under the vaulted ceilings of the historic opera house, echoes of applause still danced in the air, weaving through the opulent corridors like the closing notes of a grand symphony. Tonight, the majestic hall was decorated finely, celebrating its annual international opera competition, a festival that drew talent and spectators from across the globe. Detective Jane Parsons, who was also in attendance for the evening's program, stood amidst the glittering crowd, her eyes scanning the sweeping interior of the grand opera house. She observed the swirl of the gowns, the sparkle of the jewels, and the animated chatter that filled the room with a lively hum. As the final notes of the night's performance lingered in the air, those privy to the world of high art had seemingly forgotten the world beyond the theatre's walls. For a brief, suspended moment, the opera house was a realm unto itself, bound not by the passage of hours, but by the rhythm of music and whispered critiques. Her gaze was drawn to a tall man, Victor Caruso, whose silver mane and regal posture marked him easily as the evening's most celebrated person. The esteemed head judge. Known for his golden ear and feared for his merciless critiques, Caruso was a luminary that others could only orbit around but never eclipse. Applause thundered through the hall, and Jane noticed Victor's eyes. They were sharp and discerning, as if they held a secret. "Quite the spectacle, isn't it?" a voice beside Jane inquired. Turning, she found herself facing Liam Beluzzi, the young tenor whose performances she had admired over the last few nights. "Indeed it is," she replied, offering a smile. "This is my first full immersion in the opera world, quite different from my usual scenes." "The beauty of opera, it sweeps you off your feet or tramples you beneath them," Liam remarked with a wry twist to his lips. "And tonight, with Caruso presiding, well, it's a bit of both." The conversation was cut short, as a sudden commotion stirred at the back of the room. Jane's attention snapped towards the source of the disturbance, a small cluster of people moving purposefully towards Caruso's dressing room. Pushing through the crowd, she reached the corridor leading to the dressing rooms, just as a scream shattered the residual calm. It was sharp, laden with horror, and unmistakably belonging to someone who had stumbled upon something ghastly. Jane rushed forward with a determined step. At the entrance of Caruso's lavish dressing room, she encountered Elena Vincent, the renowned soprano, her face ashen, her eyes wide and unseeing, staring into the middle distance. "Miss Vincent, what happened?" Jane asked. Mr. Caruso, he's dead," Elena managed to choke out. Without waiting for further explanation, Jane moved past the trembling soprano into the dressing room. There, amidst the opulence of gilded mirrors and sumptuous fabrics, lay Victor Caruso. His body lay crumpled on the floor, a dark pool of blood spreading around him. Kneeling beside Caruso, she noted the stark wound, a fatal stab, precise and cruel, at his abdomen. Her eyes catalogued the scene with clinical detachment. The position of the body, the lack of apparent struggle, the solitary nature of the wound. The door flung open once more, admitting Richard Duval, the artistic director, his face contorted in shock. "What on earth?" he began, halting abruptly, as the grim scene before him registered fully. "We need to secure the area and call the authorities," Jane instructed, her voice calm and authoritative. "No one comes in or out until they arrive. Mr. Duval, would you please take charge of that?" The night had promised a spectacle, and in its most dark and twisted way it had delivered. Now, amid the drama and the soaring arias, a new, more sinister story was set to unfold. Chapter 2. A chorus of suspects. By the time the local authorities arrived, Jane had already begun to observe the surroundings and the people around her. Inspector Teller, the officer in charge, recognized Jane from previous collaborations. "Parsons wasn't expecting you here," he remarked, his tone mixed with surprise and relief. "I was just in the audience, Teller," Jane replied, her eyes scanning the room. "Would appreciate your eyes on this, then." Teller gestured towards the body, now being examined by the coroner. Victor Caruso, head judge, as you probably know. Stabbed once close to the heart, murder weapons missing, no signs of forced entry. As Jane and Teller discussed the preliminary findings, the backstage area buzzed with hushed conversations and stifled sobs. The Opera House, a revered cultural haven, now hosted a spectral atmosphere, its corridors echoing with shock and despair. Jane decided to start where all good investigations did, with the people. Victor Caruso had been a divisive figure, known for his golden ear and feared for his vitriolic critiques. The potential suspects would not be few. First was Liam Bellucci, the young tenor, whose recent performances had suffered under Caruso's relentless criticism. Jane encountered him near the stage, his normally flamboyant demeanor subdued, his eyes red-rimmed. "Mr. Bellucci," Jane started, "I need to ask where you were at the time of Mr. Caruso's death." Liam's gaze wavered slightly before meeting Jane's. I was here backstage, celebrating the end of the performance. I had no reason to, you know." "Witnesses?" Jane pressed. "Many. Ask anyone," Liam snapped, his facade of calm cracking. Next, Jane sought out Elena Vincent, Caruso's former protégée. The soprano was sitting alone in a dimly lit corner of the green room, her expression one of stunned grief. "Miss Vincent, I know this is a hard loss for you," Jane began, deciding a softer approach might yield more with the sorrowful woman. Elena looked up, her eyes narrowed in a not entirely grief-stricken manner. "Loss? Victor hadn't been a part of my life for years, not since he decided to destroy my career with a few choice words." "Where were you during the murder?" Jane queried. "Right here, lamenting my protégée's third place. Why would I jeopardize her chances by creating a scandal?" Elena responded, her voice tinged with bitterness. Richard Duvall, the artistic director, was next. Found in his office poring over financial sheets, his alibi was organizing last-minute details with the finance department. His argument with Caruso earlier in the evening about the competition's transparency provided him with both motive and animosity, yet his alibi was solid, corroborated by two flustered accountants. Lastly, there was Alex Rourke, the mysterious figure few knew about. Tracing him required delving into the shadowy corners of the Opera House, where Jane finally found him, surprisingly, in the library, a place one wouldn't expect to find a private detective. "Mr. Rourke, you're a hard man to find," Jane commented as a greeting. "That's generally the point, detective," Alex quipped, closing the book he wasn't reading. "What can I do for you today?" "I'm curious why a private investigator would be interested in an opera competition," Jane mused aloud, watching him closely. "Aren't we all just looking for a little truth and beauty, detective?" Alex smiled cryptically. "I was here on behalf of a client, afraid I can't divulge more. Professional ethics, you understand." Jane nodded, not pressing further. She understood the rules of his game all too well. She left him with a reminder that he was not to leave town, a statement met with a nonchalant shrug. Returning to Inspector Teller with her findings, Jane felt the familiar thrill of the chase. "Seems we have our work cut out for us, Teller," she remarked, reflecting on the night's discordant conclusion. "Indeed, Parsons," Teller agreed, a sigh escaping him. "And the opera, tragic as it is, must go on." Chapter 3, Notes of Discord. Jane Parsons. The devil was always in the details, and in this case, the devil played to a tune of jealousy, ambition, and despair. She knew she needed to ask more questions. Certainly she would land upon some clue. Her gaze rested momentarily on Liam Bellucci, who was leaning against a marble pillar, his face a mask of shock, or perhaps feigned sorrow, the sheen of sweat on his brow twinkling under the chandelier's light. "Mr. Bellucci," Jane approached, her voice firm. "May I speak with you?" Liam's eyes looked red-rimmed and wary. "Yes, but I didn't kill him. I already told you that." "I'm merely gathering information," Jane reassured. "You were quite vocal about Mr. Caruso's criticisms. Did your last interaction escalate beyond words? Liam shifted uneasily. He could ruin a career with a single word, and he used many harsh words on me. But kill? No. He paused. He said my voice lacked the passion it once held, accused me of not living up to my early promise. And did that anger you? Jane probed, noting his clenched fists. Anger, yes, but so much more sadness, Liam confessed. It's like being in a constant state of falling from grace. Jane nodded, jotting down notes, then excused herself. Next, she decided to speak with the soprano Elena again, who stood at the edge of the room, her presence almost spectral. Elena, once a shining star under Caruso's tutorage, now relegated to mere background noise. Miss Vincent, may I have a moment? Eleanor's expression was smooth as marble, her voice when she spoke, cold and controlled. Detective, it's an opera house. Tragedies are expected, aren't they? On stage, if not off. Your relationship with Victor Caruso turned quite sour, Jane began, watching Elena closely. Sour is an understatement. Elena flicked a dismissive hand. He destroyed my career because I dared to surpass him, because I could sing the roles he no longer could. Her bitterness was palpable, like a note held too long. But murder him. Please, I am a singer, not a killer. Yet anyone driven to the brink could be pushed to extreme actions, Jane countered softly. Perhaps, Elena conceded, her gaze drifting towards the heavy velvet curtains that veiled the stage. But my revenge was to live well, to teach others. He couldn't take that away from me. Leaving Elena to her ghosts, Jane found her way to Richard Duval, the artistic director, whose reputation danced precariously on the edge of a sharp knife. His expression was unreadable as he discussed the evening's chaos with a group of patrons. As they dispersed, Jane approached. Mr. Duval, a word if you don't mind. Richard's smile was tight, practiced. Of course, we are all devastated by the night's unforeseen finale. Your recent conversations with Mr. Caruso, they were quite heated, about the integrity of the judging process, Jane ventured. Richard's eyes darted around the room before settling back on Jane. Victor was a man of rigid opinions. Our discussions, yes, they were robust. But murder him, that would jeopardize everything I've worked for here. Jane sensed the shield of self-preservation rise within him. And yet desperation often leads to rash decisions, she suggested. Desperation is for those who have something to lose, Richard said, his tone a blend of defiance and a challenge. Finally, Jane decided to probe Alex Rourke, the private investigator, a little bit further. Alex, an enigma wrapped in the casual garb of indifference, merely nodded upon seeing Jane again. I was hired to find information on Caruso. It seems I wasn't the only one interested in his secrets. By whom? Jane pressed. That, Ms. Parsons, is confidential, but I assure you, my role was to observe, not to act. Jane, assessing his measure, decided there was more beneath his surface. And what did you observe? A man surrounded by enemies, some out in the open, some hidden where you least expect. The night waned and the final guests trickled out into the darkness. Tomorrow, Jane decided she would get one step close to the mystery. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. As Jane moved through the ornate corridors filled with portraits of past legends, her mind replayed the tragedy of Victor Caruso's final moments, turning her keen instincts toward the undercurrents that had so adeptly remained hidden beneath the surface. She decided to visit Liam Bellucci. His dressing room, a modest cubicle adorned with bouquets of wilting roses, smelled heavily of cologne and sweat. Liam sat before a mirror lined with bulbs, his face a landscape of worry lines as he traced them with a quivering hand. Detective Parsons? Yes, Mr. Bellucci. May we talk about Victor Caruso? The mirror reflected his abrupt grimace. Caruso, the great tormentor of my life, he spat bitterly. You know, detective, an opera stage isn't just about voice. It's also the playground of egos, especially for people like him. Jane noted his raw anger. Liam's laughed, sharp and devoid of humor. He nearly ruined me. His last review claimed I was more suited to singing in the streets than an opera house. After such words, which patron would throw a dime my way? He stood abruptly, pacing like a caged tiger. But murder him? No, I didn't. Jane observed him closely, noting the tension in his shoulders, the quick glance toward the door. Next, she paid a visit to Elena Vincent, the soprano-turned-mentor, whose relations with Caruso had soured into a taste as bitter as gall. Jane found her in the theatre's small library, surrounded by old scores and newer grudges. Elena rose, her demeanor as rigid as her posture. "Detective, you come seeking ghosts. Victor's ghost, which haunts us all now, I suppose." "I'm interested in the nature of your relationship with Mr. Caruso," Jane ventured, observing the clenched fists of the once celebrated soprano. "It was a bond gifted and then cruelly revoked," Elena responded, her voice laced with a nostalgia tinged with venom. "He made me, and then unmade me with a few slashes of his pen. He said the opera required fresh voices, as if mine had aged like sour wine." "And your thoughts when you heard of his demise?" Elena paused, a shadow crossing her sharply featured face. "Relief, detective," followed by sorrow. "It's complex, like any act of a lengthy opera." Leaving Elena's conflicted emotions in the library, Jane then sought out Richard Duval, the artistic director. Duval greeted her with a cautious nod. "I understand you're untangling some uncomfortable truths, detective." "Yes, your recent arguments with Caruso included. Care to elaborate?" Duval sighed, the sound echoing around the cramped office. "Caruso believed the competition was tainted, rigged," he'd said, but his accusations were pointed at me, insinuating that I was a marionette dancing for the highest bidder. "And were you?" Jane's query sliced through the air, sharp and direct. "Absolutely not. My integrity isn't for sale, detective. I fought with him, yes, bitterly so, but to preserve the sanctity of our art." With this, Jane walked out of his office when she saw Alex Rourke again. "Mr. Rourke, you are still here?" His eyes, sharp and calculating, weighed her before he spoke. "Now, detective, I already told you why I am here, but revealing client confidentiality would be bad for business. But I will give you a clue. Let's say I was here to investigate whether Caruso's pristine reputation was all smoke and mirrors." Chapter 5. Crescendo of Clues. Jane was mulling over the clues when she saw Inspector Teller approaching. "Hello, Inspector. Do you have anything to share with me?" she inquired. "Yes, as a matter of fact I do, Parsons. We have information that Victor Caruso's previous assistant quit just 2 days before the grand competition. The circumstances are precarious, but it seems there was a row. She also handled all the finances between the opera house and Victor's company." "Perhaps," Jane replied. "We should look at all the ledgers and transactions." Teller and Jane started poring over the financial records. "Look here, Inspector," she said, pointing to a sheaf of papers. "There are irregularities in the opera house finances. It seems our esteemed head judge may have been more than a harsh critic. He might have uncovered something that led to his demise." Teller looked surprised. His interest piqued. "Go on," he urged, leaning forward. Jane picked up a different ledger, her finger tracing a line. "See here. There are multiple withdrawals from the funds intended for the competition's prize money. The amounts don't align with the official payouts. And there's a pattern of frequent, unexplained expenses labeled simply as consultation fees." "Do we know who approved these transactions?" Teld asked, his eyes narrowing. "The initials ST appear next to each entry," Jane noted, her mind racing. "Sophie Townsend," Teller exclaimed, "Caruso's old assistant. Could she have had access to enough information to manipulate the accounts?" They both thought aloud. "It's entirely possible," Teller affirmed. "We need to bring her in for a conversation." Sophie Townsend was ushered into the interrogation room. Her demeanor was a blend of nervous apprehension and muted defiance. Jane sat across from her, a calm yet imposing figure. "Miss Townsend, we found some inconsistencies in the financial records of the Opera House. Your initials appear next to several questionable entries. Can you explain this?" Sophie's hands trembled slightly, betraying her composure. I only did as I was instructed. Mr. Caruso often told me to handle things discreetly. He said it was for the good of the competition. But these discreet transactions, were they common knowledge among the staff or something more clandestine? Jane pressed, her voice steady, probing. Sophie hesitated, her eyes flickering to the door as if contemplating escape. It was always private. Mr. Caruso, he had many enemies. He believed someone was trying to sabotage his work, his legacy. Jane leaned back. Was there anyone else who had access to these funds, someone who might have influenced these decisions or benefited from them? No, Sophie insisted, a hint of earnestness breaking through her facade of reticence. It was only ever Mr. Caruso and me. He trusted me. Yet you left your job just prior to the competition, Jane remarked softly, her eyes locked on Sophie's. I believe Mr. Caruso was close to uncovering something, a financial anomaly, perhaps created or discovered by you. Was his murder an attempt to silence him before he could reveal more? Sophie's facade crumbled as tears welled up in her eyes. You don't understand. He was more than just a boss. He was everything, the center of this world. I couldn't bear to lose that. Jane's expression softened slightly. Miss Townsend, fear can drive us to desperate acts, but it doesn't justify them. Help us understand, and we can help you. As they spoke, the pieces of a larger puzzle began to align. The fierce ambition and bitter rivalries, the clandestine financial dealings, all orbiting the slain figure of Victor Caruso. Chapter 6, Intermezzo of Shadows. Next, Inspector Teller spoke with Sophie. Miss Townsend, what more can you tell us about Victor Caruso? Sophie looked at the inspector. He had exacting standards, and his disposition could turn quite harsh if not met. Teller watched her closely, noting the tremble in her voice. Was there anyone he was particularly harsh with recently? He was often harsh, but more with some than others. Sophie, our investigations have uncovered certain financial discrepancies linked to the competition. You handled much of the budgeting and accounting, correct? Sophie's face blanched. Yes, but I assure you, every decision made had Mr. Caruso's approval. Approval or not, something doesn't sit right, Teller countered, his voice steel cloaked in velvet. Where did the funds go, Sophie? There was a palpable tension. The air felt thick, heavy with unspoken words. Sophie's face crumbled, the facade of composure finally fracturing under the weight of her secrets. It wasn't supposed to happen this way, she whispered, looking pleadingly at Jane, defeat tracing each syllable. The pressures, it was all too much. Jane leaned forward, her gaze locking onto Sophie's. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. And she did. Sophie spoke of the overwhelming debts, the desperate measures, the siphoning of funds into shadow accounts, each confession more startling than the other. Jane understood the desperate act that culminated in Victor Caruso's grim demise, a death orchestrated not out of malice, but panic, an intermezzo of shadows that had escalated into a sinister finale. You are not to leave town until this investigation is over, Ms. Townsend, said Inspector Teller. We will be verifying all the facts. Parsons, let us go see Duval right away. If he is indeed the murderer, then he could be a flight risk. Chapter 7, The Final Act. Mr. Duval, we need you to come clean about the embezzlement of the competition funds. You and Ms. Townsend planned this together, and when Victor Caruso found out, you killed him. No, that is not true, Duval said with desperation in his voice. It is true that Sophie and I planned to embezzle the competition funds, but I did not kill him. Then who did? Jane asked. I did, said a shrill voice. It was Sophie. I didn't mean for things to get this far, she murmured, her voice tinged with despair. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she nodded slowly. He found out. He threatened to expose me, not just to the authorities, but to everyone. My career, my life, it would all be over. And that's when you decided to kill him, Jane said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, undeniable and final. Sophie's face crumpled, and she buried her face in her hands. I didn't plan it. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. She looked up, her eyes raw with emotion. That night, the finale, the drama, it was all too much. He confronted me, here in this room. He was furious, more than I had ever seen him. I panicked. Inspector Teller listened, her expression unreadable. Go on. He grabbed me, Sophie's voice trembled as she spoke. I thought he was going to hit me. There was a letter opener on the table. I didn't think, I just acted. It was self-defense, but then and there was so much blood. And in the panic that ensued with the finale, you thought it would go unnoticed, Jane concluded. Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. I never wanted any of this. I'm not a killer detective. I was just so scared. Inspector Teller took a step forward. Sophie, a man is dead, and while your fear is palpable, it doesn't excuse your actions. You need to come with me now. We'll need to go over everything formally at the station. As they exited the room, Sophie handcuffed, the distant sounds of the opera's conclusion echoed through the hallways, a poignant reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded behind the scenes.